Hi there, it's Richard Marker. This is the Wise Philanthropy channel, which is a project of the Institute for Wise Philanthropy. Delighted to be with you. Today, I'd like to talk about an issue of some significant concern to the philanthropy community. It's going to start appearing to be a political statement, but if you bear with me a few minutes, you're going to see that I'm really talking about something much larger than that. And in the second presentation along this topic, you're going to see how there are some real dilemmas for the philanthropy community going forward. But first, let's give a context to what I'm talking about. I call this session "The Big Lies and the Opportunity and the Dilemma for Philanthropy." So let's talk about the lies. Now, as I'm speaking to you, the election is over. Well, there are a few miscellaneous skirmishes on the side, but I think for all intents and purposes, we recognize that Mr. Biden, Vice President Biden, is now the president-elect of the United States. But one of the things that we see is that over the last number of years, there has been a real diminution of truth in public discourse. And more troubling is the number of people who at least ostensibly buy into overt falsehoods. Now, let me be clear. This is not a political statement per se. There are many people who voted for the current president who did so recognizing full well that not everything he said was true. And as a matter of fact, many of the things he said were not true, but for other reasons, chose to vote for him because of policies or whatever the purposes were. There are a small percentage of people that buy into the big lie about the pandemic, about the election, about all sorts of other things in public discourse. The fact that so many people, not 70 million, but the fact that so many people buy into that should be a challenge and a problem for all of us as we begin to move ahead. Now, part of the challenge of that, of course, is that emerges out of the confluence of a few factors that are important for us to take seriously. One is a disregard for government per se that's been around now for almost 2 generations. That's quite problematic, the idea that somehow government by definition is bad, and that we should do everything possible to be suspicious of the implications of government. Now, it's true that there have been plenty of people who have abused their roles in government, and money sometimes has distorted the perspective of how government should work. But on the whole, most of us, I think, know that we need a viable government, and we need a governance system that has credibility for a democratic, and I mean that with a small d, system to work at all. The other element of it, though, that's even more problematic is a more conceptual framework. And that is that we are still in the early days of the anarchy that comes with the internet. You know, it's less than a generation old. And most people have gone to school without having any understanding of how one makes sense of the availability of all information on that we can see on site. Some of us may have other forms of information that we can use to judge it, but that's usually because we've had an education which gives us some perspective to know how to test things out. But for too many, the ready accessibility of information on the internet has led to essentially an anarchization of truth. And people therefore have either believe everything or nothing, or more problematically, they believe what they choose to believe independent of any independent verification. That's totally unrelated to Mr. Trump, and that's totally unrelated to the current political environment, but it leads directly to it. Now, in order to address that question is a long-term question. That's a systemic question. It has a lot to do with education. It has a lot to do with how we understand our role in society. It has a lot to do with whom we consider to be appropriate mediators of legitimacy. That's, as I say, a systemic question that's not going to be resolved on January 20th of 2021 when we have a new administration come in, even had that administration had an overwhelming landslide on the local, state, and federal level. because it's a problem that goes beyond electoral politics. However, what we saw is in electoral politics, and what we've seen vis-a-vis the pandemic, is the number of people that just have their own self-authentication of what's true and what's not true. That's a problem. Now, why is that a problem that philanthropy is well suited to begin to address, but is a dilemma as well? You see, philanthropy at its best has the autonomy to address long-term questions without the concern of a plebiscite, without having to be accountable to voters, without having to be accountable to short-term kinds of reports, quarterly reports, as a for-profit company has to do. And so at its best, philanthropy can begin to put in place those kinds of systemic variables and indications and interventions that might address or might begin to address some of the underlying issues that that this anarchy of information and of truth is about. So one of the opportunities we have in the philanthropy world is to somehow take a deep breath and say, what can we do with our autonomy, with our unique autonomy, with our privileged autonomy? And we're going to come to that in the second section as to whether that's good or bad. But with our privileged autonomy to say, this is not acceptable. The society cannot live long if nobody knows what to believe, or there is no common understanding of how one verifies something so that the people can make good communal decisions. Individuals can always have the right to live their own lives privately, to make decisions for themselves. But when illegitimacy emerges from not understanding what truth is, and it's imposed on the body politic, and when it's imposed on the larger society, that's a time when we have to step back and say, this is not sufficient. As I say, this is not a political statement. This is a statement about what we in the postmodern world, in the 21st century world, have to confront as we think about what education should be, as we think about what does it mean to be a public citizen, as we think about what does it mean to have civil society, what does it mean to have public discourse. Those are challenges that go beyond any particular electoral moment or even any particular party. And so one of the opportunities that we have in philanthropy is to step back at this particular loaded time and say, okay, we have to begin to put our resources into play to address these long-term systemic problems. There are other systemic problems. There's issues of equity. There's issues of racism. There's issues of insufficient healthcare. There's all sorts of questions that are systemic. But one of the ones that certainly cannot be ignored at this moment in time, that has been so surfaced in the last number of years, is the entire question of epistemology, how we know things, how we believe things, how we understand them, and how we as a society can act on them. That's a challenge. It's an opportunity for philanthropy. But when you tune into the next chapter of this discussion, you're going to see that at this particular moment, it is not only an opportunity, but it presents us with a very significant dilemma. So I look forward to seeing you soon again on the Wise Philanthropy channel. This is Richard Marker. Thank you so much for joining me.